Once, silence fell upon the streets of Europe. Cities stopped breathing. People bowed before an invisible enemy that seemed to descend from the sky. A plague, so fast, so merciless, that even speaking its name filled hearts with terror. In just a few months, half of Europe vanished. Doors were nailed shut from the inside, caravanserais stood empty, and bustling ports turned into silent graveyards. People whispered only one thing: the Black Death has come. But in the heart of this storm of death, there was one city that refused to fall, as if an unseen shield protected it, a place historians would later call a miracle that defies logic. Lübeck, one of the few cities that survived the grasp of the Black Death. How was this possible? Was it mere coincidence, or was there a hidden secret? This is the forgotten story of the Lübeck miracle, a horror that wiped more than 25 million people off the face of the earth in just a few years. How did this happen? Was it a coincidence, or was there a hidden secret buried deep within the city? The Black Death, the most terrifying nightmare of the Middle Ages. The bubonic plague could destroy a human within days, weakening the body, covering it in dark sores, and silently ending a life. People of that era had no explanation. In the streets, one whisper echoed everywhere: "This is God's wrath." But the truth was even darker. The plague marched across Europe like an invisible army. It spread through the great sea trade routes, rats hiding in sailors' clothing, tiny but deadly fleas clinging to their fur. Without realizing it, people were carrying death into every port, every market, every home. The Black Death could not be seen, but it breathed behind every step. These invisible carriers were the silent spark of a disaster that would bring Europe to its knees in just a few years. Lübeck, in the 14th century, stood as one of the most powerful trading cities in all of Northern Europe. It wasn't just a city, it was the beating heart of the mighty Hanseatic League. Every sunrise brought new sails to its horizon, ships packed with spices, salt, furs, metals, and hundreds of sailors and merchants pouring into its bustling streets. In other words, Lübeck was connected to every corner of the known world, and in a time when the Black Death traveled silently from port to port, this should have been a death sentence. One infected ship, a single rat, and the city could have fallen just like countless others. By all logic, it was only a matter of time before the plague reached Lübeck. But something extraordinary happened. While entire regions collapsed and great cities vanished from maps, Lübeck remained standing. Its markets stayed alive, its people endured, and its streets did not fall into the silence that swallowed so much of Europe. Historians still call it one of the era's greatest anomalies, a place that should have been destroyed, yet somehow survived. For centuries, historians have tried to understand why this happened. How did Lübeck survive? How did it stop the plague? The answer lies in three major factors. Factor 1. The city's layout. Most medieval cities were packed with narrow, airless streets, but Lübeck was different. Stronger airflow, a more open street structure, markets spread across wide areas. In other words, the environment the plague needed to spread simply wasn't strong here. Factor 2. Salt, wind, and environment. Lübeck was the center of the sea salt trade. The city stored massive amounts of salt, and salt has natural antibacterial effects that slowed the growth of disease. On top of that, the constant sea winds brought fresh, clean air into the city. For plague-carrying rats, this was not an ideal environment. Factor 3. Early quarantine measures. Lübeck's leaders made a remarkably smart decision. As soon as the disease approached, the city gates were partially closed. Merchants arriving from outside were forced to wait 40 days before entering. In other words, quarantine. The very word quarantine comes from this practice, 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Lübeck was one of the earliest cities to implement it. The day the Black Death entered Europe, the entire continent seemed to hold its breath. At first, strange rumors spread through the small port towns. Ships were arriving at the docks, but most of the crew were already dead. The few who managed to step onto land collapsed and perished within days. People had no idea what was happening, but one thing was painfully clear: an invisible catastrophe had set foot on the continent. It didn't take long before the noise of the streets vanished. The narrow alleys once filled with trade and life were now ruled only by the wind. Doors were nailed shut from the inside, and windows were covered with dark cloth. People avoided each other. If someone merely sneezed, neighbors slammed their doors and hid inside. In the center of every town, bells tolled, not for prayer, but for death. Each ring marked another soul gone. Even the grave diggers were exhausted. Hundreds of bodies were gathered each day, and there was no space left to bury them. In some cities, cemeteries were so full that the dead had to be thrown into massive pits. The earth itself seemed tired of opening new graves. Churches overflowed, and priests no longer had the strength to offer prayers. Some barely had the strength to stand. With each passing day, the darkness grew heavier. Trade had collapsed. There was no bread, no clean water, no medicine. Craftsmen were dead, artisans had fled. Caravanserais stood abandoned. Livestock wandered the streets without owners, and farmlands were left uncultivated. Entire villages had disappeared. Not a single living person remained, just silent. Deserted homes swallowed by time. So many people died that sometimes only one child survived from an entire family, too terrified to even step outside. After months of relentless quarantine, the city fell into an eerie silence. The church bells that had tolled every night, marking yet another life lost, suddenly stopped. No announcement, no celebration, just silence. It was the kind of silence that made people freeze behind their doors, listening with their breath held. There were no coughs echoing through the streets anymore, no weeping, no footsteps. For the first time in months, death itself seemed to have grown tired. In a dimly lit house, an old man slowly stepped toward his window. His fingers trembled as he pulled the curtain aside. The street lay empty, but the smell of death was fading. He took a deep breath, the first real breath he had taken in months. He walked to his door. For a moment he just stood there, hand on the latch, as if opening that door meant stepping into another world. Then, quietly, fearfully, he pushed it open. The hinge groaned. A cold breeze swept inside, carrying the dust of forgotten days. He stepped outside. A few houses away, a woman did the same. Her face was drained, her eyes sunken, her hands shaking. But in her gaze there was something searching, something alive. One by one, more doors opened. People emerged like survivors of a long darkness, blinking at the daylight. No one spoke. No one cried. They simply looked around, at the empty streets, at abandoned carts, at half-open windows, at a city they once knew, now unrecognizable. When they reached the marketplace, they stopped. This place had once been the heart of life, filled with merchants, laughter, arguments, children running between stalls. Now the tables were rotting, Sacks lay torn open, and the only movement came from the wind weaving through the ruins. From the crowd, a small boy stepped forward, 8 years old at most. He looked up at the sky, where the sun struggled to break through the clouds, as if it too had been sick for months. In a quiet voice, he asked, "What do we do now?" No one answered. No one could answer. They had survived. But surviving was not the same as living. A woman knelt down in front of the boy. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held a fragile spark. "We live," she said, "all of us, again." Behind her, the old man raised his hand slightly, as if speaking to the whole city. "This place has lost much," he said softly, "but not everything. If we are still here, then life is still here." The camera rises slowly. The group of survivors stands in the middle of a silent, wounded city, a city scarred, broken, but not dead. The sun finally breaks through the clouds, flooding the streets with warm light. A final voiceover echoes, "The Black Death took millions, but it could not extinguish humanity." And on the last day of quarantine, those who remained learned one truth: no matter how long the darkness lasts, the light always finds its way back.